I may be crazy, but I ain't no ordinary fool. Right now, with the berth in the Fantasy Football Championships on the line, I will say this. There is no back that I would rather have in my fantasy football lineup than Chase Brown, and that includes Saquon Barkley. There's no way Joe Burrow is going out there to try a tush push anytime soon. Brown and Barkley, for that matter, find themselves amongst elite company, running backs that are considered must-starts from this point on. The only other backs that are in that conversation, in that tier, heading into the fantasy football semifinals are Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Josh Jacobs. More on him in just a second. Now, one injury note here is that David Montgomery, he was ruled out for the season after tearing his MCL during that Lions loss to the Bills. That was in week 15. Now it's time to turn our attention to week number 16. And RotoBaller is here to help fantasy football managers make those tough lineup decisions with our week 16 starts and sits at the running back position. Starting with James Conner of the Arizona Cardinals as they take on the Carolina Panthers. James Conner keeps on churning out the production as the weather gets colder and the games become more meaningful. Conner has now put together back-to-back weeks in which he has produced more than 22 fantasy points, including the 30.8 fantasy point performance there against the Patriots last week, where he averaged 6.9 yards per carry on his way to 110 rushing yards and a pair of touchdowns. Conner has registered double-digit fantasy production in 11 of 14 contests this season. And there's a game there that was at 9.9, so you could probably bump that to 12 out of 14. But hey, we are going by the numbers. Heading into week number 16, the Cardinals' workhorse back finds himself as the RB10 in fantasy with 224.4 fantasy points and an average of 16 fantasy points per game. Conner is now only 27 yards shy from back-to-back 1,000-yard rushing seasons, and his 973 rushing yards, that sits 9th in the NFL. How has Conner been able to find this kind of production? How about 568 yards coming after contact? That is the 6th most. He also averages 2.62 yards after contact per attempt while forcing a league-high 62 missed tackles thus far. With Conner's recent success and a matchup against the Panthers, a team that has allowed a league-high 28.44 fantasy points per game to the running back position this season, that has got to get fantasy managers excited. Carolina, they've also allowed 15 rushing touchdowns through 14 contests. So if I were a betting man, I would bet on Conner to add to that rushing total this week. Another running back who's been pounding in the touchdowns as of late. You know we love our tutties here in fantasy football. James Conner's doing it, and so is Josh Jacobs. He's basically nuked the entire Packers passing game. It's bad enough that managers have to deal with start and sit questions when it comes to Romeo Doubs, Jaden Reed, Christian Watson, Tucker Kraft, Octavian Wicks, Bo Melton. Am I missing anybody? Probably not. It is hard to watch this go down because we know Josh Jacobs is this entire Packers offense. And basically, until further notice, you have to fade any pass catcher that the Packers have. Since week number 7, only Saquon Barkley's 204 and Jahmyr Gibbs' 182 fantasy points are producing at a greater rate for their managers than Jacobs' 178.4. Over those 9 weeks, Jacobs has averaged 22.3 fantasy points per game, while Barkley has averaged 22.7. So this kind of puts you in the conversation. Jacobs is right there with Saquon Barkley here in recent weeks. A very good reason as to why Jacobs is a must-start. His production and his volume are going together. We see that production. We also know he's getting 18 carries in 6 of the last 7 contests, resulting in 6 20-point plus performances over that period. Now, I'm not sure if this week's game script is going to have Jacobs involved as much as he was last time, where he had touched the ball 9 times in the first 10 plays, but I do know this. The Saints, they have allowed 14 rushing touchdowns to running backs on the ground this season, and that is the 2nd most. New Orleans, they're also allowing 23.71 fantasy points per game to opposing backs, a number that is certainly going to increase here in week number 16. And the 3rd start of the running back position, how about Jerome Ford of the Cleveland Browns as they take on the Cincinnati Bengals? We know this Bengals defense is bad, so if you got someone on the offensive side for the Cleveland Browns, you're probably firing them up this week. Some prominent names may be available out there to put in your lineup, but if you need a running back and you're searching the waiver wire, check to see if Jerome Ford's out there. On Sunday, Nick Chubb, he started to actually look kind of like Nick Chubb. He looked good against the Chiefs. That was until he broke his foot. When Chubb exited, that opened the door once again for Ford, and hey, he produced, albeit nobody started him, but he produced. Now Ford, he replaced an injured Chubb, and he broke off a 62-yard touchdown run while adding 22 more yards on the ground on his 6 rushing attempts. Meanwhile, when Chubb was on the IR earlier in the season, Ford, he was productive in his opportunities. Between weeks 1 through 4, Ford had 10 or more fantasy points in 3 of those contests, including an 18.9 fantasy point performance there on opening weekend. Ford is positioning himself as a potential league winner for fantasy managers as we head into the semifinals. This week, Ford faces that aforementioned Bengals team, that defensive unit that is allowing 314 rushing yards, 166 receiving yards on 17 receptions to opposing backs over the previous 4 weeks. Now let's take a look at those running backs that we should be fading here in week number 16. And I'm going to start with Rico Dowdle of the Dallas Cowboys as they take on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. With a berth to the Fantasy Football Championships on the line, I am looking to avoid risk the best way that I can. And that includes avoiding bad matchups whenever possible. Such is the case this week with Rico Dowdle as the Dallas Cowboys head to Tampa Bay to take on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Vita Vea, we know he is a bad man. We all know that. We also do know that over the last 4 weeks, Tampa, they're allowing just 13.9 fantasy points per game, second only to Detroit's 11.28 in fantasy futility against the running back position. Over that time, Tampa has allowed 257 total yards, 184 of which have come on the ground, along with a single touchdown. The recent competition, or lack thereof, may I say, has helped the Buccaneers stat line. There's no question about that. But the way I see it, the way Baker Mayfield has been playing as of late, Dowdle, he could see his game script getting flipped here as his volume slowly disappears and slides over to CeeDee Lamb and Jake Ferguson as they become more involved in this Cowboys offense as they have to play catch up this week. Now, another running back that I'm sitting this week, and probably a running back you should be sitting since he's returned to the lineup, is Isiah Pacheco of the Kansas City Chiefs as they take on the Houston Texans. Since returning in week number 13, Pacheco, he has produced, I guess is the best way to put it, fantasy outings of 5.9, 8.1, and 5.7 fantasy points. That's an average of 6.9 fantasy points per game. For perspective, Sinceri McCormick, 9.7 fantasy points per game. Ray Davis, 8.2. Jaleel McLaughlin there, 7.9. Jalen Warren, 7.4. Tank Bigsby, 7.3. Kendre Miller, 6.9 fantasy points. They are all outperforming Pacheco over that same period. Looking at week number 15, the Chiefs backfield, it was split. Both Pacheco and Kareem Hunt saw a snap share of 37%. Hunt and Pacheco each had 13 carries and 1 reception, while Hunt, he had an additional target thrown in there. Kansas City isn't concerned about your personal achievements. They want to get to the playoffs with that number 1 seed and searching for that NFL's first three-peat ever. Now, considering that this backfield is split and this matchup is difficult, it's hard to envision a scenario in which Pacheco hits double digits for fantasy managers. Houston, they're also allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points on a per game basis at just 18.09. If you split that number down the middle, that's just 9 fantasy points. Simply put, better options are available that carry less risk and have more favorable matchups. One of those matchups that's not as favorable is the one that Joe Mixon has to face as those Houston Texans take on the Chiefs. And we know that there's no team that has done a better job at frustrating fantasy managers this season than the Kansas City Chiefs. Not just offensively, but if you've got a running back, you simply cannot play them against this Chiefs team. Entering week number 16, the Chiefs are allowing just 15.2 fantasy points per game against. That is the fewest in the NFL. That's actually 2 fewer points than the next closest team, the Philadelphia Eagles. The Chiefs have allowed just 885 rushing yards this season through 14 games. That's 63.2 per contest and just 292 receiving yards to the position. Both league bests. Mixon, he started the season like a man on a mission. Coming into week number 16, he sits 90 yards shy of 1,000 yards, which will be the 5th time in his 9-year career that he has hit that milestone. Mixon also ran for 100 yards in 5 of the first 6 contests to start the season. However, over the last 5 weeks, he's hit the century mark just twice. That is worth noting here. Now, it's not easy, and I get it. It's not easy to sit a running back that has 12 total touchdowns this season, so I get fantasy managers' refusal to sit him this week. Consider him your running back, temper your expectations, play of the week. That is why he's included in this list. When firing Mixon up in your lineups, just make sure that you have a solid floor player there to kind of help mitigate the risk there, the potential risk from this matchup. And if you want to mitigate further risk, head over to RotoBaller.com for all the latest news and fantasy analysis. And head over to the RotoBaller Discord channel where you'll catch me there 24/7 answering all your starts and sits questions. See you next time.